House Leader, third party. Leader, third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I continue my place in this debate after the demotion I just received over lunch. For those on Hansard, I was introduced as the House Leader of third party instead of the Leader of third party.
Leader of the third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I rise again to continue my place as designated Speaker from the third party on Bill 53, the Recall and Initiative Amendment Act 2018. Honourable Speaker, I kind of want to summarise where I left off at the last, just before lunch. As I left off, we're standing here in this legislature essentially debating this. On the one side of this House, we have a party and a third party, a government and a third party, who are supporting legislation which will eliminate big money from recall campaigns and initiatives. What that's saying is that this act will come in play, that this act, that is the Recall and Initiative Act, will come into compliance in essence, or come into be similar to the Elections Act, which the Liberals voted against, mind you, to ban big money from BC politics. Now, what the official opposition is arguing, in summary to this, is they're actually arguing against this bill. In essence, this is what they're saying. They're defending the ability of one individual or one corporation with deep pockets to spend millions of dollars because he or she may have a personal grudge against an MLA. And they're aggrieved by the affront to democracy that this would have by not allowing one individual with a grudge against an MLA or one individual with a grudge against a government's policy to be able to spend their millions to actually recall an MLA or put forward an initiative. You know, members opposite last, but they have, I mean, the member from Kamloops, North Thompson, who seems to find this all very funny, should probably spend more time talking to British Columbians about how happy they were that big money was finally from BC politics. And let's see him defend and stand up there. Stand up and defend the fact that they, the BC Liberals, continue to argue that it is okay. A year after we banned it from BC elections, they continue to argue that it is okay for a corporation to intervene in our electoral process and spend millions of dollars because they don't like an MLA or they want an initiative. This, to the BC Liberals, is democracy. On this side of the House, we're saying enough of that. You clearly, you being the BC Liberals, have learned nothing from the last election. You have not listened to British Columbians for the last year and a half. You continue to think that British Columbians think it is okay that you seem to see that your only goal in this legislature is to stand and complain about the fact that you're in the opposition at some point. Honourable Speaker.
Through the chair.
At some point, Honourable Speaker, at some point, the BC Liberals need to recognize that they're in a timeout, that they're going to be sitting in opposition for a long time. And as soon as they come to realize that, they might actually, Honourable Speaker, start to debate issues that matter here in the province of British Columbia, not issues that are come to the foundation of their existence as a party and their quest for power. I cannot believe this. They seem, Honourable Speaker, not to have learnt anything. Honourable Speaker, they seem to not recognize that the people in British Columbia are cynical about the BC Liberal approach to politics. They seem to not recognize that it is not okay for friends and donors to that party, through you, Honourable Speaker, the other party that's not on this side of the House. It is not okay for them to have corporate donors give them hundreds of thousands of dollars and then them make decisions, some of which I hope to explore in the weeks and months ahead. Decisions that clearly are not in the best interest of British Columbians, but are clearly in the best interest of the donors to the party making those decisions. This, Honourable Speaker, is what we're hearing. We're hearing a defense of the status quo from a couple of years ago. The status quo that put opposition where they are. And in the debate, their critic to this bill, the member from Vancouver Langara, did not once mentioned the fact that this bill is actually banning big money. His remarks to the debate were a diatribe, a continuation of the 36 hours we've had to sit here and listen to the drivel, Honourable Speaker, yes, drivel, misinformation, alternate facts emanating from members opposite as they try to campaign on a quest of fear over proportional representation. You know, again, they clearly haven't understood that in British Columbia, the largest voting demographic are the millennials now. The largest voting demographics are the millennials. And what they don't understand, Honourable Speaker, is that millennials are voting out of hope. The hope expressed by the two parties over here working together, and they're not reacting to the fear of a dynasty from the last century, struggling to find a mandate for itself, unable to define who they are, but united under one quest, the quest for power. The quest for power, Honourable Speaker. They have the gall at times, Honourable Speaker, to suggest somehow that ride-hailing not being brought in, it's going to come in this fall, not being brought in now, was somehow not their responsibility, Honourable Speaker. I sat in this legislature, Honourable Speaker.
Members, please continue.
I sat in this legislature, Honourable Speaker, and not once, not twice, but 3 times brought in a private member's bill. They had every opportunity to enact, to bring in ride-hailing 3 years ago. 3 years ago, but Honourable Speaker, they didn't do it. Why? Because as I pointed out before lunch, the cynical framework that governs the party opposite is one in which it's all about power. And heaven forbid they actually bring in ride-hailing in the lead up to the 2017 provincial election and alienate a few key ridings south of the Fraser that they were hoping to get. Fortunately, they were trumped out by removing some tolls on those same ridings. But nevertheless, it wasn't brought in. So there is simply no high ground for the members opposite on this file. In fact, it's almost humorous when they bring it forward. Coming back to this Recall and Initiative Amendment Act, again, we're seeing nothing more than consistency here. Eliminating the ability of big money to influence politics in BC in its final form. Coming to some of the changes that I outlined earlier that are happening. You know, we know that the Election Act was amended last year, and that this particular component, the Recall and Initiative Act, was not. So right now, all that's happening, this is what we're debating here, not proportional representation that they're hung up on. Honestly, I come back to it, 36 hours in here. I've heard the same speech 36 hours. For those riveted to Hansard, just go back and type in the words stacked deck and see how many of the members opposite have been reading their media lines. Changed game, rigged game. Look up rigged game as well. They have a 22-year-old staffer down in the basement who's writing them speeches, and we have the puppets opposite who read the same speech, member after member after a member. It's frankly embarrassing, Honourable Speaker, that we have 41 members, 42 now, members opposite, 42 members opposite who collectively cannot write an independent speech. And we have to listen to that here.
Members.
We'll have to listen to that here.
Let's get back to the bill,
coming back to the financing, we know that this act aligns financing rules for recall campaigns with the Election Act and changes that were made last year in the Election Act amendment changes last year that, of course, members opposite also voted against because, of course, they still want big money in politics. We know that this bill before us is banning union and corporations, just like has occurred in the local government elections, school board elections, and provincial elections. We know that it's setting $1,200 limit to contributions for individual British Columbians, just like exists in the Elections Act, just like exists in local governments and school boards. And we know it creates a third-party spending limit of $5,000 for advertising during the recall petition period. These, frankly, were needed changes. Frankly, I do not think it is okay if somebody with a grudge or an MLA who happens to have access to a deep corporate sponsor could somehow, in the case of an MLA who perhaps there might be a recall campaign, could go to somebody and get several $100,000 to prop up a campaign, spread disinformation. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right that the opposite could occur. that a particular vested interest could fund solely a campaign initiative in British Columbia. You know, these are common sense changes, Honourable Speaker. And I get, again, these common sense changes make the Liberals feel uncomfortable, Honourable Speaker. They make them feel uncomfortable because they've been playing by this rigged game with a stacked deck for far too long, Honourable Speaker. And what they're finally seeing is that rigged game with a stacked deck is being fixed. And they can't take it. They can't take it because they know, Honourable Speaker, they know that the reason why they were able to remain in power, the reason why they were able to ignore British Columbians for so long, was because they could appeal to their corporate donors for vast quantities of money to ensure that they got the airwaves filled with their message, went on character assassinations of anyone who opposed them. That's the way they go. That's the way they operate. But look at where we are now. Corporate donations no longer. The BC Greens are nipping at the tails of the BC Liberals. In terms of annual funding, Honourable Speaker, we are not too far from them in terms of annual funding. That's what happens when people have to support parties, not vested interest, Honourable Speaker. You know, as I said, the bill's common sense. Only one recall campaign can exist at a time. Now, I heard the member from Vancouver-Langara somehow think this was an affront to democracy, clearly not even listening to his own arguments during his diatribe. Because on the one hand, he would suggest that it's important for people to actually have an attempt to follow through with a recall, and that maybe now it might be misused. Well, in actual fact, the best way to misuse a recall campaign would, as soon as somebody did one, is to start 3 others. And you get people not knowing which petitions they sign. This is actually cleaning up a problem that existed. How can we have, with the GST initiative that went forward and passed, the HST one, what if we had 4 that were running at the same time? 4 initiatives like that. How would that initiative been successful? There would have been many people who signed it who said, I've already signed it. Confusion would have been about. So that's common sense rule number 1. Again, BC Liberals hate that because it's not the kind of status quo of their cynical party politics from the past. You know, another smart change. We're getting a prohibition of a recall petition 6 months before general voting day for a scheduled election. My understanding is I think there was a recommendation for a year, but this is a compromise from what was actually asked for by the Chief Electoral Officer. 6 months makes sense. It's kind of ridiculous to be able to have a recall campaign initiated in 6 months, so that after you have the 30 days, you've got a few months left, you call a by-election, and the person basically may not even come into the legislature for very much, and you swear him in, you swear him out, back to the election. It's consistent again with by-election legislation, Honourable Speaker. The 6-month time frame is entirely consistent with that. Make some positive changes, this Act does, to violations of the Act, and it provides the Chief Electoral Officer with regulation-making authority. What it's not doing, Honourable Speaker, despite the fact, if you listen to members opposite, you think the world was going to end, Chicken Little and his friends or her friends opposite would suggest that the sky is falling. This bill does not provide any new protections for MLAs. It actually creates a level playing field that ensures the interest of British Columbians are front and center, not vested corporate and union interests. If there's a, 40%, if people wanted to make this harder, they would have pushed it up to 50%, to 60%. 40%, nothing has changed with that requirement of 40% of the electorate. It's a very high threshold, a hard threshold. But it is still the only threshold that exists in Canada. We are the one jurisdiction that has that. I don't hear us today saying, let's repeal this legislation. I don't hear government today saying, oh, let's make it 60%. I don't hear government today saying, let's ban donations. All I hear in this bill is government putting forward a very, very reasonable approach to protect our democracy from the influence of big money and special interests. And to conclude, I have sat here now, it must be 2 weeks, listening to members opposite in question period, in speeches. It seems that they have forgotten what it means to govern in this province, what it means to be in opposition. The role of an opposition is not to try to solely argue for everything in terms of trying to actually save a party and get back into power, no matter what. It's about representing the will of the people of British Columbia. The will of the people of British Columbia is that big money be gone out of politics here. Oh, thank you to, I don't know whether I'm able to acknowledge somebody not sitting in their chair, but to somebody who normally sits down in the Premier's chair for the support of this. Of course, the member from Kamloops North Thompson is shocked that the Premier would support this bill. What should be shocking to the member from Kamloops North Thompson is the fact that their party, Honourable Speaker, are yet again, standing up before British Columbians and saying it is okay for one corporation to donate whatever they want because they have a grudge against an MLA to try to out that MLA. Or it's equally okay for the member of Kamloops North Thompson to go to a corporation and say, I have a recall campaign against me. Can you give me $1 million to fund a no campaign? He's essentially arguing that's okay. That is the essence of the argument that we have before them. The members opposite think this is funny. But what is funny is their lack of moral compass, Honourable Speaker. The fact that their wind vane is broken, it's spinning. There's no direction, there's no values. British Columbians don't know what they stand for, apart from trying to get back into power to ensure that their vested corporate interests are at the table through donations to actually ensure that their friends' interests, as opposed to British Columbians' interests, are put front and center in this legislature and decision-making in British Columbia. With that, Honourable Speaker, I proudly stand, my colleagues proudly stand in support of this speech, and I look forward to continued debate. Thank you.